Without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panellists. In the far corner, we've got Daisy Pearson, who is a long-time activist and a brilliant designer, and also works for Global Justice Now. We have Tyrone Scott, who's also a wonderful activist and is working for War on Want. And finally, we have our main speaker today, who's Keval Bharadia, who is a former financier who used to work for the London Stock Exchange for 15 years, and then resigned in protest in 2010. And since then has been working to dismantle that system. And so that's what we're going to hear about today. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Thanks everyone for coming, and to the organisers for putting this on. I really appreciate it. It started about 6 months ago from a chance encounter via FreeCycle, fantastic service. I met Caroline, who runs the Wandsworth branch for XR, and picked up some stuff from her. And then saw some posters on her front door, which on her window, which was like, you know, XR branding. And we ended up talking about XR a little bit, and climate change and waste and consumerism and all that sort of stuff. And she's like, oh, what do you do? So, oh, I used to work in finance, and now campaigning against the City of London, against the trading in financial markets, and trying to take a systemic view on how we combat the climate crisis. And she's like, well, why don't you come and talk about that in one of our XR branch meetings? And I did, and I think they seemed to enjoy it, because or enjoyed it, and now 6 months later, here we are with this, so that's great. I didn't always grow up in Wandsworth, actually. I grew up in Brixton. It's very different to growing up in living in Balham, which is, you probably know, is quite gentrified. And the 1980s in Brixton, I'm not sure if anyone experienced living in those sorts of places, was quite rough. There was the big Brixton uprising in 1981. I'm not sure if people remember that. I remember going to school, and you know, my friends in the playground were talking about their brothers and their parents being caught up in the violence, which is essentially Margaret Thatcher's, getting onto the streets, forcing people to get onto the streets to combat what was then austerity. And now, 40 years later, we seem to be fighting the similar battle. So there's always been this sort of, I guess, inherent in me, some sort of politicization coming from the area that I lived in and grew up in. The other aspect to that, growing up in Brixton, was recognizing that I kind of have quite a dysfunctional and different family to a lot of my friends. So I grew up in a house with 12 family members in Brixton, council house that we were given. And my parents, they came from East Africa, came here to the UK in the 70s, and they met, got married, and we found this house. And I was born in Westminster, born in St Thomas's Hospital, right opposite the Houses of Parliament, which it's going to be a recurring theme, the Houses of Parliament, today. You know, it was one of those eras in the 1980s, you probably remember it, where it was a lot of contrasts. You had a lot of imagery on TV around the wealth of finance. You know, you had films like Wall Street. I'm not sure if you remember that film, the original Wall Street. And I'm not sure if you remember watching Trading Places as well, the comedy with Eddie Murphy. And I think being young, seeing these movies, and then juxtaposing that with my lifestyle, where I was the youngest of 12 in the family, where the conversations were very adult-themed conversations around money and who's contributing to what bill, and when are we going to get turned off. And you see, my dad's a carpenter, and he built this huge notice board that he put outside, just on the way out on the front door. And every day on the way to school, you'd see the bills go from like black to red. So there was this strange dichotomy of growing up in this sort of highly politicized, working class, poor environment, and yet seeing on TV there's loads of money, wealth flowing around and being bombarded with this imagery of, well, actually, it's all there for the taking. And innocently, anyone can go and, work in finance and make a ton of money and everything will be fine. The British version of the American dream was all there. And strangely enough, in my secondary school, which the year I left closed down and got turned into luxury flats in Brixton, there was a careers pamphlet which I flicked through and I saw an apprenticeship at the London Stock Exchange. And I was like, this is brilliant. I can go to the LSE at 16 and have 2 years worth of college paid for. I can leave at 18 with a few A-levels, go to university. I'll be, I wouldn't be disadvantaged. I'll be advantaged. I'll be having 2 years worth of work experience. Brilliant. And got into the LSE at 16 and started, industriously working, getting through my apprenticeship and having a really, really good time. And at 18, I was like, I want more of this. I applied for a full-time job and got a job there. And they managed to pay for my university as well. So I was working 4 days a week and going to university in the evenings, doing a business course, business and finance. As you do, working in finance, that's the sort of thing that you do, and learning about economics, learning about mainstream classical economics, the economics of trickle down, the economics of all a rising tide lifts all boats, economics of the free market, the normal things we get that the media talks about as being beneficial. Competitive advantage, all of these things, why we need patents, all of that stuff. And from my perspective, it was just about trying to ease the family finances. And in the mid-20s, by my mid-20s, it was, that was what I did. We were far more comfortable. I moved to Balham. That goes to show what sort of income I was on. The last job I had when I quit in 2010. The last job I had started around 2005, where I was head of product development. So within 11 years of working, in my mid-20s, I was running a department, and I was responsible for designing financial products, financial markets for the London Stock Exchange. And it was focused on a particular aspect of finance called derivatives. And don't worry, you don't need to know anything about what derivatives are, how they function, any of that for the purposes of today. It's probably important to remember is that we're talking in 2006, 2005, 6 and 7. So it's a few years before the crash. And one of the projects that I was given multi-million pounds to run, so visiting investment banks around the world at that time, was to design essentially a financial system that would uncover the inside of derivatives trading for investment banks who were trading multi-billion pound trades of debt, essentially. And that debt included subprime mortgages, which was mortgage products sold to people who fundamentally couldn't afford them. But once they get repackaged through the financial system, they no longer are toxic debts. They're in fact actually quite lucrative debts because they've got other bits and pieces in them. So you've got these, essentially you're trading bits of paper with multiple contracts and debts from around the world. And you wouldn't really know the insides of them because there'll be wads of contracts. And traders would just go and trade these products. And the banks themselves wouldn't know the inherent risks that they had. And therein lied the problem with the financial system at the time in 2005, 2006. We got the service to launch in 2006 through a lot of hard work, and it never got used. The bankers were like, actually, Keval, you've done a fantastic job in designing this product, designing this service. But essentially what you're doing is you're making the level playing field for investment banks. And they thrive on trading the unknowns because they want to know, they don't want the other side to know exactly what's inside these trades. There's almost like an inherent dishonesty in finance, in trading. And I was in my mid-20s. I was quite naive to that, thinking, "Well, this is insane. Why wouldn't you want to do this? This can actually improve the situation. This can improve and uncover and provide some transparency." But actually, the banks don't want transparency, right? That's another thing to point out. And then at the end of 2006, something bizarre happened. The stock exchange said, "Oh, you've done such a really good job with this service, even though it was a failure. But here's a ticket to go to one of the Queen's garden parties." I was like, "Why are you sending me there?" So anyway, I took my mum along to Buckingham Palace as a treat from the LSE for basically producing this global service that wasn't used. And this was before I became politicized and became obviously an anti-monarch. And I kind of went along and enjoyed the sandwiches, and Mum had a great time. And, it was just a bizarre thing to see the idea that within these circles, within the aristocracy, within the landed gentry, there isn't this concept of like accountability, essentially. It was just basically, well, you win some, you lose some. And then 2007, Lehman collapsed, Enron collapsed, and it was the beginning of the beginning of the end of the financial system in that period, in that epoch. And we were like, we knew this was going to happen, which was different to the narrative. The narrative was, "Oh, we never saw this coming." The narrative was like, "Well, it's just a few bad apples. It's not a systemic problem with finance." And that's definitely untrue. But you have to almost be inside this animal, this monster, to see how toxic, how dishonest the markets operate. At that point, I thought, okay, well, fair enough. I'm head of a department here. I have some influence. So I thought, have some say in at least fessing up and taking some responsibility for what happened. And I got absolutely annihilated by management, by the investment banking community. It's like you cannot accept responsibility, because you open that door slightly, and then who knows what's behind it. So there was this absolute clampdown of anything that would be close to coming to terms with what the finance sector had done, which was cause global misery. Millions and millions of people lost their homes. Not just that. As you remember, in 2010, the coalition government here in the UK and many other countries around the world said that the financial crash was unexpected, but we're all in this together. And the way that we're going to get out of this is by cutting welfare. And that was the beginning of another round of austerity. And we know now, 10 years later, in 2020, studies have been shown that in the UK alone, 150,000 people died from austerity alone. Great Ken Loach film. What was that film about the bench trying to Daniel Blake? Absolutely, that was brilliant. And when I was watching that film, I was in tears throughout the whole of the film, and it kind of resonated personally because I was working in the industry that caused multiple deaths, and it was really difficult thing to take. And I had no option at that point. In 2010, I was marginalized from my work. I was black sheep. I was an outsider, trying to encourage workers, investment bankers, finance, hedge fund managers, private equity firms to take responsibility for what happened. And no government really in the world, perhaps except for Iceland to some extent, did anything about this. Instead, what they did was just ratchet it up and said, let's just put the pressure on the poorest in society, who are going to bear the brunt of this. And that was untenable for me. To some extent, I did have the comfort and some savings to say, well, I'm out, I quit. They were like, well, do you want to stay? We'll give you more money. I was like, no. And I quit in 2010. there was no real option for me to stay in the UK. I felt I just needed to kind of be out of London. And I moved to India, and I kind of was staying there on and off for about 5 years, actually, getting away, trying to get that blue blood, that city blood out of me that had been ingrained. So from about 2010 to 2015, I started working for children's orphanages. Complete different environment. Didn't have to worry about budgets or finance or money or dressing in a suit and going on the Northern Line every day. Absolutely different environment. Instead, it was working with wonderful children who predominantly came off the streets, came out of railway stations, disabled. And what we realized actually were a lot of these children were born abled, but were made disabled in order to encourage more begging and things like that on the streets. And a lot of them had a history of sexual abuse. So I was working in that environment, taking on new skills, learning, trying to grapple with what had gone on before with working in finance, and then seeing the complete opposite end of that world. I'd come from a world where I was speaking to investment bankers about responsibility taking. And they were like, well, I've just put a down payment on a Ferrari and I don't really want to use this service of yours. Going into a completely different environment, working with children in India who were the most destitute people on the planet. And it was an eye-opener because it was a reminder of things that we see in the UK that we don't put our finger on usually, which is that we live in a fundamentally broken economy. This idea that wealth here in the UK or anywhere gets properly shared, decision-making gets properly shared, that we actually live in a functioning democracy. These sort of myths get blown apart when you spend time with the most vulnerable, the most destitute people on the planet. It's simply not true. And it was a informative as well as heartbreaking and life-changing experience. But 5 years after spending that time there, I was broke. All my savings basically were plowed into projects in India. And I was like, well, what do I need to do? I need to probably come back to the UK and find a job. And I don't go into finance. I don't go into finance. But what I have to do is think to myself, well, there's these NGOs. What are they up to? How are they solving finance? How are they solving climate change? How are they solving inequality? What are they doing about the world's biggest problems? So I started loosely consulting for different NGOs. So I started working for Oxfam, helping them figure out how financing of coal plants works and how do corporations raise capital so that they can build coal plants in the global south. What's the mechanisms for that? We're churning out a few reports for them. I started working for Christian Aid, working on their Big Shift campaign, and a few other Tax Justice Network. Again doing some work on that, with them, and then seeing how these NGOs operate and how they conceptualize some of these big problems of the planet, which felt to me very, very isolated to one another. It felt like there was a team trying to solve inequality. There was a team trying to solve climate change. There was a team working on gender injustice. And they weren't potentially kind of looking at the system as a whole and how the system reproduces a lot of these issues. And I think perhaps being long in the tooth and consulting for these NGOs and coming in as a private sector consultant, as a consultant for all things finance or all things lobbying, all that sort of stuff, like political economy essentially. I was like, well, why are you separating these problems? Like, they're like, oh no, you can't. If you're doing climate, you can't talk about inequality. If you're doing inequality, you can't talk about racism. It's bizarre. And then I had a great opportunity to meet people who are working on the Robin Hood tax. So David Hillman at Stamp Out Poverty, And as you will recall, in 2017, the 2017 Labour Party manifesto had there was a great manifesto. It had in there a proposal that I really, really liked, because it took me back to my old work. And it was a proposal for a tax on the financial markets, on financial trading, which the UK already has. So whenever you buy and sell a share, you have to pay stamp duty on that share. That name comes from basically the 1600s, where in order to have a transaction that was legally enforceable, it needed an official stamp on the document. And it's the same sort of concept. When you buy a house, you need stamp duty. You pay stamp duty on buying a house. And the UK has a tax on share trading at the moment, and it raises about £4 billion a year. So not an insignificant amount of money. And 2017, the Labour Party manifesto had a bit of a tweak to the tax, which really hadn't been changed for 400 years since this tax had been in operation, which is bizarre, because I can tell you finance has changed in 400 years. The new tax in 2017 was probably going to add an extra £1 billion into the government coffers for the reform that it was offering. And in around 2018, they were thinking about the 2019 manifesto, which was way more radical. And I said, look, I'd love to be a part of designing a better financial transaction tax. Because I said, look, at the moment, the equivalent would be like saying, you've got this tax on buying a house, but what if that tax on buying a house only applied to flats, and you're not taxing purchases on 3-bedroom houses or mansions or bungalows or cottages? That's essentially how the financial transaction tax, the way it's designed today, operates. It focuses on such a small part of the world of finance. There's probably a few reasons for that. One is there's probably not enough people working from finance who are designing progressive taxation. The other, obviously, reason is the strength of the financial lobby. Right? It's really important to remember that the biggest funder of right-wing politics in the UK and globally is the finance lobby. More than 60% of Tory party funding comes from the finance sector alone. So I spoke to the people designing looking at the 2019 manifesto, John McDonnell, the Chancellor, and said, look, let's have a financial transaction tax that covers the whole gamut of trading. Whether or not it works or not, like, just put it out there, because people need to see like how this system works. And having the tax actually gives us an opportunity to think about how the system functions. So the way that I tried to talk about the different components of it from a progressive perspective was to really drill down into these markets. And perhaps the easiest one to start with is thinking about like stock trading and taking that a bit further. So we've got at the moment a very soft tax on stock trading. But if you think about like what are these corporations? Many of them are in fact once privatized, or rather once nationalized organizations and now privatized, right? So you would remember in the 80s, there was a big campaign to privatize a whole suite of government, essentially government infrastructure, which basically means publicly owned infrastructure. And there was this myth that there was this huge amounts of inefficiency within civil society, the civil service, and that included corporations, whether it was British Gas, and even British Airways, for example. And Margaret Thatcher and the finance lobby were saying, well, here's a way to make it more efficient and to have ownership, because you could buy shares. Right? All of you could buy shares in these corporations and go to AGMs and get them to, be committed to climate change and, pay workers a bit better and pay their directors a bit less. And obviously that hasn't happened, right? It's a big, big lie, big myth. So this idea that you can actually tackle the issues of privatization by ramping up this tax and saying that, look, we want these organizations back under public ownership, right? frankly, going to AGMs, and one of the jobs that I had working at Christian Aid was to encourage them to go to AGMs. But even then, the narrative was very much like, can we get the board to tell the truth, right? It's like, well, I know, and that's one of the XR demands as well. Can we get government to tell the truth? I'm like, well, their salaries depend on them not telling the truth, right? So perhaps when you think about drawing our battle lines in different places, when we realize that there may be more effective or other places where we might be able to have our battles. The other thing about stock trading is that these aren't the most ethical organizations. So on the stock market, in your pensions, are arms manufacturers, right? They are big pharmaceutical organizations who have not given patents out on COVID, and that caused millions of premature deaths in the global south who didn't have access to vaccines at that time. Right? So there's a whole, if you go through all of the sectors in corporations, you'll see that there's a real big problem in accountability and responsibility taking. And a financial transaction tax, a tax on all of these corporates in a much more effective way, enables us to say, look, we can see this rising, this burgeoning profit, and we want to take that profit, appropriate it, and do something better with it. The other aspect of looking at corporate stock trading is to think about like the fossil fuel lobby, which I know is really important to XR and climate change. So you've got BP and Shell who are traded on the stock market, producing enormous profits. Like last year, year before, each of them produced about £30 billion in profit. But what people don't realize is actually, if you look through their accounts, they have around the same amount of money that they have in their profits. They have trading portfolio. So that actually they have teams of people who, inside BP, inside Shell, who just simply trade the markets. So what these organizations have become, and many sectors are doing this, they've become financialized. So they're moving away from necessarily like doing their bricks and mortar work, but actually internally have these departments where it's just much easier to go onto the financial system, take their profits, and just start trading. And you think about BP and Shell, who are trading oil and gas, right? It's like a cartel, essentially, right? So the prices that we were paying for oil and gas, our energy bills, were through the roof. So not only were British Gas making money from the fact that through our rising bills, but the price at which we pay is a function of what speculation is going on in the oil and gas markets, right? So it's just like one big Ponzi scheme, basically. Right? Then you've got the insurance companies as well. They're a big part of your pensions. Insurance premiums are going up and up and up. Right? There's no sense of the fact that like if you don't claim on your insurance, why aren't premiums going down? Right? There's a huge. It's insane. Like it's theft on an absolute catastrophic scale that we just seem to normalize in this country. The other market that's really important, I've just touched on, is this commodities market, right? So at the beginning, you've got oil and gas. Oil and gas traded. So once it's mined and extracted, it gets traded through the financial markets, and then it goes to refiners and end users. So the price at which the market pays for oil and gas is determined by traders sitting in London and traders sitting in Wall Street and Chicago. The global trading of oil and gas is dominated. The 2/3 of oil and gas trading is done out of London, New York, and Chicago, which says a number of things actually. So like it reminds us like where power like lies in terms of minerals and resources appropriated from the global south, and where then do corporations, essentially corporations are protected here in London, they're protected here in London, in the UK, and in the US under corporate laws, which is the inverse of what they can do in the global south. So Global Justice Now is one organization that works on corporate courts, which is essentially saying that, like, if corporations, Western corporations, if there's an impact on their profits, because, for example, a government in Africa wants to nationalize its oil and gas, that company can sue that African state for loss of profits. Right? And so actually, and the nationalization of oil and gas could contribute to local resources being spent on building schools and hospitals. But no, if it affects the profits of that corporate, they would sue. And that's just one market. If you think about, like, lithium and cobalt that's used in technology, rising market, this stuff that's now, unfortunately, mined under military occupation in many countries is traded in London. We still have a 400-year-old institution not far from here called the London Metals Exchange. You know, that's the center for trading metals, industrial metals. We also have here in London the gold and silver market, right? The gold exchange. The world's gold exchange is based in London, right? Absolutely astonishing that these markets still are here and are prime targets for this whole industry of extraction and plunder that has been going on for 400 or 500 years. The other sad thing about the commodities markets, actually, is that it is the center for trading food crops. And again, the increasing privatization of our entire food supply and food standards agencies is dominated by these corporates using these financial markets, where you're seeing an increasing amount of trading and speculation going on in food perpetuated by the agribusiness industry. And it's astonishing. And where is that traded? The market for major food crops in the world, the global market for wheat and cocoa and orange sugar, is in Chicago, right? And it's astonishing that the world's food supply essentially is a function of what traders in Wall Street and Chicago determine it should be, right? A complete loss of like what we people can, 3 minutes, what we the people can determine should be like our vested right to our own land, our own commodities, our own resources. Like, there's a complete loss of that. In the last couple of years, there's been a lot of work to think about what does it mean to be an anti-racist. We all witnessed the George Floyd moment, the statues, and then the subsequent announcements by every organization to say that they're committed to being anti-racist and have lots of EDI policies now, and talk of organizations thinking about reparations. But one of the debates that I've been trying to engage in is to say that reparations isn't a payout of any single institution. It's saying that we all together have lost our autonomy under this free market system. So it was only really 300-400 years ago that we were overrun by this unique free market system, where we all now have to get up, go to work, sell our labor. And if we don't sell our labor, bad things happen, right? So that's one of the problems of our world economy. And actually if we want to think about climate change, we have to think about how to fundamentally change our world economy, how to change that C word, I'm not sure if I can mention it, capitalism. That's where we need to go. Thinking about all of the financial markets enables us to see the totality of all of the money that these corporations are making across not just our labor, but our commodities as well. we've got all of the markets. So the four biggest ones: the commodities market I spoke about, the stock trading market, the currency markets. But this is the wholesale trading of currencies done by corporations and governments, enabling them to then act out, or go and trade overseas. And then you've got the enormous market for trading of debt and interest rates. And all of these markets are essential to the functioning of business and finance. And these guys are the enemy. So if we want to have a tax, if we did have a tax on financial markets, on these capital markets, which every 24 hours is worth $16 trillion. Yeah, way more than GDP, way more than debt repayments to World Bank and IMF, way more than money hidden in tax havens. It is the total sum of our exploitation and our future exploitation. Because if you think about what share prices actually are, they are indicators of what this corporation is going to earn in the future. Right? That's what you're trading. You're buying into this corporate's future profit profile, right? Which we know is more exploitation, more power taken away from people. So having just a minuscule tax, a global minuscule tax on this $16 trillion every day could raise, well, 1% tax would raise 160 billion per day. Right? 160 billion pounds per day can be put into financing a just transition, a Green New Deal, solar plants everywhere, hydropower everywhere. Like the idea that we don't have any money to spend on moving towards a fossil-free fuel future is obviously nonsense. And what a tax on financial markets allows us to do is to expose that bubble and burst that bubble essentially. Sorry for running out of time, but yeah, let's take more questions if we can. But look forward to everyone's responses. Thank you.
Yeah, that was really brilliant. Thank you so much, Keval. And I'm really glad you mentioned the C word again there. It's yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that talk. There's so much, and I'm sure that you guys have questions too. First, we're gonna hear from our panelists, just a chance to respond, just saying as much as you want to say, and then we're going to throw over to some questions, and I might send a couple other things across to provoke if we feel a bit dry, but I'm sure we'll have loads to talk about. So would either of you want to jump in first?
Cool. Does this work? Oh, yeah, it's definitely working. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Tyrone from War on Want. Definitely recognise a few people in here. But if you don't know War on Want, we work in the UK with our partners across the world, predominantly the global south, to look to fight against the root causes of inequality and injustice. And yeah, really happy to be here today. It's obviously doing this talk around the economic systems, and I guess it's quite difficult to follow you, Keval, as you're basically the expert all of this, and now to figure out something else to say as an addition. But I think one of the key things that Keval mentioned was around the broken economic system, which again, he can explain much better than I can. But one of the things that really stood out from that speech is obviously how broken the economic system is, but also how it's quite clearly a rigged economic system as well, in that those who are supposed to benefit from this system are benefiting from that system, and that's the way in which it was designed, and that's the way it's been for 500 years. 500 years of our... I want to move this up a little bit. Thanks. I think it's better. But this rigged economic system that for 500 years, the capitalist logic of exploitation, people extracting limitless amounts of resources, and the Earth's natural resources has fueled slavery, it's fueled colonialism, and fueled imperialism, which has created this global rigged economic system with the deepest roots in racialized and gendered injustices, and sort of embedded the idea that people and ecosystems in the global south and other parts of the world, but predominantly the global south again, can be sacrificed because they have less value than those here and the richest countries in the global north. And sort of underpinning this rigged economic system again is the unfair and unequal trade and tax rules. We spoke about the ISDS, where the corporations can sue countries, which is again used against countries that often have less wealth than these major corporations too. Making global south countries dependent on international loans and export-led trading models. And then these nations must pay back these unjust colonial debts, which has caused a global debt crisis across the global south, with 64 countries right now spending more on their debt repayments to the global north than they're able to spend on healthcare systems, never mind on money they can spend on looking to mitigate and adapt against the climate crisis, the crisis which they've done the least to cause. And this is the thing with the climate crisis. The climate crisis is not just an injustice in itself, in that those who have done the least to cause this crisis are those who are suffering the most, but it amplifies every existing inequality which is baked into a system which sacrifices the poor, those who are black, brown, and indigenous. And it already robs many across the global south of the most fundamental of rights, which is the right to live free and with dignity. And that's why so many communities and majority of us here, I'm sure, are backing calls for reparations and reparatory justice, are backing calls for debt cancellation, are backing calls to ensure there's adequate financing for the loss and damage and continuing loss and damage. And one of the great things from Keval's talk just then is there's a lot of talks around the need for reparations, and I don't think there's, hopefully in the room anyway, many arguments against this being a necessity. But what sometimes we don't get into the finite details of how this can be financed. I think, as we all know, we're in a very unequal world, and the money is exactly there, it's just in the wrong hands. But to hear a sort of well thought out, reasoned and practical way in which that tax can be applied to redistribute some of that wealth and pay back what is owed to countries across the global south is really refreshing, and hopefully something we can continue to take forward. Because as you said there, corporations, I'll check my notes, I can't do what Keval did with no notes and speak for half an hour in that level of detail, which is incredibly impressive. But we speak about who should pay for climate reparations, but again, these major corporations and governments, but we always talk about governments, these major corporations that, just 100 corporations are responsible for a massive 70% of all global emissions. And UK-based fossil giants like BP and Shell, who we've just heard about what they do with their trading, raking huge profits while continuing to extract oil and gas from countries around the world and paying little to nothing in tax. And even when we do have inadequate tax schemes put in, like the windfall tax, then they'll find loopholes anyway to not have to pay even the inadequacy, which is the windfall tax within itself. So again, putting effort and time and resources behind, or campaign resources behind, the ideas that Keval has just spoken about are so important. In fact, I'll just finish there, but it's just, really good to hear that chat. And looking forward to continuing to explore more of these ideas with Keval and everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyrone, and over to you, Daisy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. There's so much in what you both have talked about there, and there's a little sort of narrative in my head that I want to try and weave. But forgive me if that means that I sort of repeat some of the things that you've said. What Tyrone has just said, that is a really important kind of grounding in understanding that the current global economic system that we have is essentially a continuation of colonialism. So it's this. All the wealth that we're talking about here that currently sits in the city of London was amassed through the exploitation and extraction from global south countries. And exactly as Keval's talking about there, those kind of the basic commodities, like in the olden days, it was the East India Trading Company, and it was coffee and cocoa and sugar, and it still is, and it's all of their raw materials. And now that we've kind of got that big startup of wealth, the financial system is that kind of is the continuation of that. It's, you need that input, and once you've got the money, you can keep using that to make more money and more money. It's a neo-colonial process of extracting from the global south. That money is still coming from the global south. There's a fantastic stat from Jason Hickel, which is for every $1 that moves from the global north to the global south in terms of financial flows, $24 flows back. Some of that's illegal, some of that's kind of, tax dodging and stuff like that, but a lot of that is legal. A lot of that is just like the basic normal processes of global finance. It's It's tax havens and tax evasion, which isn't illegal. A big part is interest on debt. So we've talked a bit about debt today and how completely unfair the global debt system is. Because global South countries are seen as a riskier investment, the way that kind of some of these big hedge funds and investment banks manage that is to say, well, you know, it's riskier, we might lose our money, so we're going to charge you extortionate interest fees, sometimes up to 20% interest fees. And in theory, that's so that they can protect themselves in case they don't lose their money. But these banks are too big to fail, and they never do lose their money. Somebody bails them out. So it's completely having your cake and eating it. They get to extract this insane amount of wealth, and then it's fine, they get paid off anyway, even when countries like Zambia default, as so many of them are right now. Money is hemorrhaging from the global south to the global north. But capitalism is also changing. I am going to be using the C word quite a lot, I hope that's okay. Capitalism is changing. There's a real emergence of what we kind of start to talk about as monopoly capitalism. And whilst inequality on a global scale is actually reducing, or has been reducing between countries, overall it is increasing, and that's because a lot of it is increasing within countries, and that's because of this extreme amount of wealth that the mega rich have been able to amass recently. And so much of that is through financialization and through the financial system. So the finance industry has grown dramatically over the last few years. I think it's increased something, I'm bad at stats. It's increased something like, it tripled in size over the last kind of 40 years. And not only is that the finance industry itself, but it's the financialization of other industries. So exactly as Keval was talking about, you get kind of financialization, speculation happening within all of our other basic commodities. So oil and gas, food, all of that. And what a lot of that ends up looking like is, so hedge funds and investment banks will buy up perfectly healthy profit-generating companies and go, how can we make these even more profitable? And so they'll get those companies to borrow very heavily, so it's not at their own risk at all, and cut costs wherever possible. There's a huge amount of monopolization going on, so lots of kind of mergers and acquisitions, big corporations buying up smaller corporations, extracting as much wealth out of that corporation as it is possible to. We talk about economies of scale, and I want to talk a little bit of some of the kind of the myths of capitalism, is that even though, you know, many of us in this room, I kind of think we'll be at the point where we don't believe the lies about trickle-down economics anymore, and a lot of that has happened, you know, a lot of that myth-busting has happened on a public scale, but I think a lot of the values that we were kind of taught to believe are still very endemic in our society. So this idea that overall, you know, that global finance benefits everybody because it's a wealth creator. And that possibly was true when it started. Like we need finance, and the kind of financial market started as a way of financing things that other people need, of creating wealth for the economy. But as the financial sector has grown massively and out of control, it has become a wealth extractor. So when your hedge funds and your investment banks buy up these smaller companies and go, how can we extract even more wealth? We talk about economies of scale. Actually, what economies of scale often means is that we are too powerful to mess with. We're going to fire staff, we're going to cut your wages, we're going to bust your unions, and there's nothing you can do about it. We're going to squeeze suppliers, we're going to charge higher prices to consumers, and all of that money goes to shareholders. And that's why we've seen the dramatic increase in the number of billionaires over the last 20 years. And particularly at times of crisis, these corporations are very good at exploiting and profiteering at times of crisis. And a lot of what kind of Keval was talking about was with kind of speculation and that innate dishonesty, is there is so much profit to be had through that uncertainty. It's the kind of disaster capitalism that Naomi Klein talks about, is whilst everyone else is suffering from those dramatic consequences, some people are winning, and they're winning big. I guess to bring us back to the issue of a financial transactions tax. Interestingly, I currently work for Global Justice Now, and we're part of the ATTACK network, which is a kind of progressive sort of activist global network that was set up to counter globalization in the early 90s. And It's still a very big global movement. And I found out whilst researching for this that the ATTAC network, which literally stands for, in French, the kind of organization for the financial transaction tax, and citizen action, that's the last bit. So Global Justice Now has been sort of working on this for a very long time. And I think one of the things I'm really interested to kind of get into in the discussion is to what extent this is winnable now in our political climate, given that we're in very different political context to 2016, 17, when you got it into the last manifesto, because, Corbyn, RIP. To what extent it's winnable? I mean, on the one hand, part of what you're saying is like a huge amount of money can be made from a very small tax, and that makes it quite politically winnable, quite politically persuasive. On the other hand, there's a risk then that you're not actually getting to the heart of it. If you're not fundamentally kind of dismantling this this financial system that it has got so out of control, then are you leaving that in place? And I want to just end on one thing, which is I wanted to mention Nicholas Shaxson has written a fantastic book about a lot of this called The Finance Curse. And one of the key things that he bases his argument on is the fact that there's a kind of upside down curve of the bigger of the financial sector of any country gets, it starts to add to the country's GDP. Once you reach a certain sort of like sweet spot, and it gets too big, it starts to reduce the overall GDP of the country. So this is what I was talking about, of the transition from wealth creation to wealth extraction. And countries like the UK and the US that have outsized financial markets are actually poorer. We are all poorer as a result of the oversized financial sectors in the UK. So I am a big supporter of anything that might start to rein in and disincentivize this sector and weaken it a bit. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Daisy. I'm gonna bring that all into another question as well, and then throw it back to you, Keval, if that's all right, before we go to audience questions, because I think a lot has been thrown up there, and something we're probably all thinking is, what can we do, and what is it that we should be doing now? And I think Daisy's brought up some really interesting points, and some of those had been with me as well, because the 2017 manifesto and then the 2019, they were also built in conjunction with Caroline Lucas, who had been working on that transaction tax since its inclusion in the 2011 Green New Deal, which was obviously not long after the financial crisis. And so that's why it had become sort of really prominent in the Green New Deal, and it was a big way of funding that kind of new growth, green growth. And you've actually spoken a lot about that today. And the reason why I bring that up again is because a lot of what you've said feels like it's within the context of a broader program, of which the financial transaction tax is one part. And so, you've talked about reparations, and you've also talked about reparations as restoring autonomy, which I think is a really beautiful way of talking about it. And at some point you also talked about nationalisation and potentially renationalisation, which would also potentially apply to industries in the global south, which would be important for price setting and things like that. So there's kind of a lot of different policies that actually are floating around in what you're saying, as well as the tax. And I think that's something that I wanted to talk about. And then to Daisy's point, which I think is kind of probably more so, especially with the badges that a lot of us are wearing, or the march that's been on today, and many of us have been on, is just kind of another manifestation of the C word of capitalism and why we need to talk about it. And it's interesting because about 170 years ago, when the Poor Law happened and that first sort of alienation of people from the land, which it wasn't that long ago, that it became a kind of domestic legalized policy, that there was an itinerant labor force that had to sell themselves. Obviously that had already happened with chattel slavery, but labor capitalism isn't that old? And immediately there was a movement, and they used to talk about how this type of capitalism was all about buying cheap to sell dear. And you said that trading, there's an inherent dishonesty, is the words you used, in trading. And it struck me that it's exactly that reason. You're trying to buy an asset for cheap and sell it for more money, and that's the whole point. So within that, you're constantly creating, the incentive is to lie. That was the kind of moral critique of it in the 1850s. But it goes much further than that. You then spoke about austerity. A lot of us at the moment are also worried about the rise of the far right and the scapegoating of migrants, as well as lots of other different marginalized groups, and also ecological policies, the same sort of policies that everyone here is really interested in. Or when something happens, for example, a canal suddenly becomes a bit more tricky to take ships through, the capitalists get really, really worried. And then the capitalist countries inflict a genocide without naming capitalism. And because they don't name capitalism, that's what they do. Because there's a strange thing that happens where when you're trying to now protect capital within this system, because capitalism demands that the shareholders don't take the hit. So it has to hit the consumers, because if the shareholders take the hit, it affects the whole capitalization of the country, the company or the corporation, and its credit prospects and its share. And the fragility that is caused by these trading markets means that it is almost unthinkable for the shareholders and for the capital to take the hit. Therefore, there ends up being a large price rise, whether it's on wheat or oil or gas. And that price rise automatically, disproportionately affects the most needy. By logic, by nature, it does, which is the cost of living crisis. That then gets scapegoated onto anyone who can be a scapegoat, but normally, in this country, black and brown people, or people who've come here in small boats, or ecological policies, or anything else that they can scapegoat, because we don't dare name the word capitalism. Because within that logic of capitalism, we can't find a way out. So drawing all those things together, the financial transaction tax being part of a slew of policies that aren't just funding, as you said, the economic transformation, but at some point that economic transformation has to, I would argue, or at least provoke, has to be away from capitalism into something completely different. So the question is, what do we do?
Have a cup of tea. The tea first, then the revolution. No, thanks very much for all of your great feedback and like discussion topics. But no, you're right in saying that we are very far off where we were politically in 2019, and that should come as no surprise to us. We have to remember that our politics is based on a function of the economy. If the economy is doing bad, you have to ramp up racism in order to make the economy work. You have to throw in the mix this kind of national chauvinism to get people to vote right. Otherwise, people wouldn't. People would actually vote. For example, Corbyn had a manifesto that included many progressive green policies, stopping austerity, renationalizing industries, and what happened at that time? Do you not remember when a acting military general said that if Corbyn came into power, there'd be mutiny, right? And I think what that has to remind us is the extent to which Britain, its economy, its military, its political elite, its landed gentry, its aristocracy, all act as one cognitive ecosystem, organism. The following on from the C word is the I word, is imperialism. Right? We still live in an age where we are driven, the world is driven by Western imperialism. Coming back to practically this policy, like we are nowhere near the political climate where we would get close to for this policy to even get an EDM in the morning, mentioned by a politician. But that's not to stop us from working. And by working, what I mean is understanding the markets that I spoke about today, and recognizing that here in London we have a responsibility to unearth what happens in the City of London, for us to become aware of the flows of extraction and plunder that gets concentrated here, but to what end? And I would argue in order for us to make international connections, first and foremost. In that there's many things that we can do as campaigners and as activists outside of trying to make things winnable. And actually, I would argue that we have to take a step back sometimes about trying to come up with, what's the next winnable thing, or how do we get to crossing off this target? How do we get this many people to protest? How do we get this many people to mobilize? Sometimes I find that in itself is sort of the NGOization of the problem, and it takes us away from what I think we're missing, which is building an international community of people who really understand how the system works. And I don't think we do. And I think here in London, we have a duty, I think, to create a much more international base to say, look, globally, around the world, London is the key center for the valuing, auctioneering, trading, and profiteering and speculation of people's labor through share prices, through global commodities, through the commodities exchanges, and which drives climate change. And let's make that more widely understood by climate campaigners around the world, so that we actually start by building a base, our power base, I mean, right? I don't think we have the power base yet for global transformative change, which is what we want. Right? We all want to be free of this deathly system of infinite growth on a planet with finite resources, right? We'd all want to agree with that. But we can't do that in one country. We can't do that. You can't have socialism in one country. It doesn't work, right? The US will annihilate you before that happens. But in the absence of that, we absolutely can get better politically at building international connections with grassroots organizations, and remembering that climate change is a symptom of capitalism. And if we remember that, then we are able to work with other groups who are also working on the symptoms of capitalism, right? Racism is arguably a function of capitalism. In order for the system to work, in order for white working class people to be completely and utterly oppressed by the system, the state has to say, oh look, but at least you're not as bad as a black person, or a migrant, or a Muslim, right? There has to be divide and rule. And that tactic has been in place since at least 500 years, perfected here by the English elite. So there's a lot of work to do, but that work isn't us saying, okay, how do we move this and mobilize this in a policy, get it through, get that 1% out of the financial system. Because don't forget, if we get 1% out of the financial system, if it actually comes into force, $16 trillion a day won't be the actual amount, because that's what's being traded today. If there's a sign that we're coming after the market, it will slightly erode, right? There will be elasticity, there'll be slight changes within it. So who knows what the numbers might end up as. But in the absence of that, I think there's a lot of work that we can do in remembering that if you're working on racial justice, if you're working on gendered justice, which we know, like radical feminists will tell us that the body will never be free under capitalist exploitation, right? So radical feminists tell us that the symptoms of gendered prejudice and exploitation is a function of capitalism. So is racism. So is the climate crisis. So what are we doing as climate campaigners to not just internationalize our movement, but to remember that we are meant to be working with other campaigners, right? And that includes socialists and Marxists. Is everyone, we should all be part of socialist organizations as well as climate organizations, for example. I think that's an important part of, I think, being a progressive climate activist. Climate change activism without like socialist politics, I think, is just gardening. We have to kind of remember that.
Thank you so much, Keval. Okay, it's time for your questions. We got one.
A very simple one. Where does Brexit fit in?
Do we take some more?
Yeah, let's take it. I'll take notes as well. So yeah, where does Brexit fit in? Yeah.
If you implement something like this in London, how do we actually stop it being just moving their transactions to Chicago or Wall Street or Singapore?
Thanks. I'll take two more. One over here and then one over there.
My question really is, can we learn something from the National Rifle Association about their tactics for undermining Americans' wish to have their children or their populations safe? Can we use their tactics to explain this extremely logical thing that you've been explaining to us, that is really clear, that we're all suffering from trickle-up economics, and tapping that into national media?
We're going to take one more and then we're going to go to the panelists.
Thank you. You mentioned working within the system, sort of like activist investors and similar. There's also a movement we could call the accountants for good, who are doing things like integrated reporting, triple bottom lines, ESGs. Do you see any potential in that?
Cool. Okay, that's great. So we've got 4 questions. I'm going to summarize them badly, but we've all heard them, hopefully. The first is, where does Brexit fit into this? The second question is about how do you implement it to prevent avoidance or, for example, people moving their business elsewhere? The third question was about the role of media and whether we can take any cues from the NRA and how they use fear and speeches around freedom and their amendments there. And the fourth question is around activist investments and things like ESGs and other things, and whether there's any mileage in some of those current vehicles. Yeah, over to you. Does anyone want to jump into any of those? Cool.
Sorry, Rob, do you mind if I briefly answer all 4 of them?
You can briefly answer all 4.
So, just quickly on Brexit, there's perhaps 2 issues. The first is that the markets like volatility, right? And Brexit created opportunity for a phenomenon known as trading arbitrage, which is a financial tactic that allows you to trade in different legal jurisdictions and benefit from the slight differences in those legal jurisdictions. And remember that Farage was a banker and knows that. The other thing to remember with Brexit, obviously, is that it popularized, or it kind of gave credence to ramp up racism here in the UK. And there was also a lot of like white working class bashing, which was abhorrent. Like thinking that, you know, why would white working class people vote for Brexit in their own, again, that goes against their interest. But again, that's them recognizing that the system isn't working for them, and believing that the government lied that it was to do with us spending too much money on migrants. There's obviously the issue is more complex than that. So there's a rhetoric of xenophobia and like nationalism that was part of that project.
Implementation.
Yeah. So that's a good question actually. So this really needs to be implemented globally to avoid movement, which is why like nothing ever substantial was easy, right? I think Gandhi says it a bit better than that. We have to transform the world, and that isn't about us trying to win this fight in London. It is about us having kind of a global hive mind, actually, about the problem, which is why the comments I made earlier was about us internationalizing this problem and creating solidarity amongst different grassroots organizations around the world who are all together working on the symptoms of capitalism. I don't think doing a NRA politics of fear doesn't feel an intuitively right thing to do. I think we win with the politics of love and solidarity. I could spend a lot of time talking about that. And investments and ESGs are a co-option of the capitalist lobby. And we need to be very, very aware of them.
Yeah, do you want to add anything? Anything you'd like to bring in?
Yeah, can I speak to the third question mostly? So to your point about the role of media, I mean, I sense that kind of maybe the question behind that is A, and this terrifies me, I have to say, like, how do we counter right-wing media? Because it's so powerful and so pervasive. And maybe the question sort of underlying your NRA point seems to be, how the hell is the right-wing media so much more effective than us? Because they have conned us regularly and repeatedly in so many aspects of our lives into voting for things that don't benefit us. So Brexit being a brilliant example of that. And they cash in, as Keval says, on the fact that people recognise that the system isn't working for us and they want change. And I have to say, I do think like the scale of the fight against that is enormous because of the amount of money that we've seen. We've talked about the huge size of the finance lobby, the huge size of the fossil fuel lobby, the fact that these people have the ears of Parliament all of the time. So I think we've talked a bit about the way in which an oversized finance sector, but also a lot of other things about capitalism has completely distorted our democracy. There's been quite a lot of studies done that, you know, say that we sort of live in, particularly here in the UK, we live in a democracy in name only. Like, actually, it's the financiers that have all of the power. And so in terms of how we fight that, I think narrative and changing the narrative is such an important point. We have to expose the way that this kind of lobbying and corruption is working. We have to draw people's attention to it. And I think we have to be able to show people that the kind of, you know, the root causes of everything that we've been talking about, and that actually it isn't innate, it isn't accidental, the system that we have now. It was very much constructed to benefit a very few people. And I guess with a lot of work and activism and sort of hope that maybe the worse this gets, the more people, and I think this has to be conscious work about with us putting an alternative narrative out there, that we don't have to have a system like this. We can dismantle these systems that don't work for us and put something different and better in its place. Yeah. Oh, and I wanted to add one thing to the second question, which was I actually got from reading your work, Keval, but specifically about, I think you said some really interesting stuff in some of your articles about the fact that London is such an important global finance centre that actually a quite modest tax, like the one that we're proposing, isn't going to scare that many people off. They need to be here. It is the largest financial sector by a very long way. I think you said it's quite conveniently placed, uniquely conveniently placed between the global markets in America and in East Asia. So implementing a financial tax here in a modest way, I don't think will actually scare people off. But you're absolutely right that this does need to happen on a global scale.
Thanks. I mean, it's quite hard to add anything else to the great contributions there from Daisy and Keval, so thanks. So I'll try and be brief again, but maybe look at the second question around how would we implement this? And, I agree, it's a challenge, and I think, building off what Keval said, it is really about building power and building that global movement of movements. It's all of these issues that we face right now, these global intersectional crises, whether it's a climate crisis, the crisis of inequality, cost of living or cost of greed crisis, are all fueled and all driven by our systems of capitalism, colonialism, extractivism, oppression and exploitation, essentially capitalism, really. And completely agree that the capitalism is racist. Climate change is an issue of race, and climate change in itself is innately racist as well, in the fact that those who are being most affected, and the reason that we've taken so long to do anything about it is those continuously been most affected have been the most marginalized communities across the world. So what we generally need is real system change. And one of the things that I often think about when we think about these solutions that we come up with, whether it's calling for reparations, that the tax, which is so important, is these aren't standalone things in the sense of if we were to call for reparations, it's not just money alone. In fact, money is a small part of it, because that's almost saying, well, we can just keep causing harm and keep destroying everything, and then we'll just throw some cash that way. And that's also not what we're trying to insinuate when we're calling for reparations. What we're calling for is a wholesale, fundamental shift in the way that we do things. So reparatory justice, is about stopping doing the harm that we're doing. It's about repairing the harm or repairing the damage that's been caused, and then compensating for that damage that cannot be repaired. And those are the sort of three ways in which we look at it. It's not just about throwing money at a problem, even though they're not doing that either, and that would be nice. An example of that would be in 2010 at the COP when rich global north countries agreed to pay $100 billion annually in climate finance. They haven't met that goal even now, and it's been 13 years since that point, and it was a 10-year target. And even then, most of that has just been repackaged into further debt that's keeping global south countries, as I said before, struggling to provide healthcare because they're spending so much money on clearing their debts. So again, we need that wholesale system change. And again, just another small example, but we have one of the things that maybe sort of gives me a bit of hope is where we do have opportunities presently to try and look to make that fundamental shift. We are moving, hopefully, even if it can be slowly, we are getting that global recognition that there is a crisis and a climate crisis. Even though the solutions are awful, there is that global, even political recognition that there needs to be some kind of shift or change or a transition. So when we speak about a just transition, and one of the things, again, which is why it's about real system changes, we can't just say, okay, we can't keep using fossil fuels or extracting fossil fuels and burning fossil fuels and other polluting things. So therefore what we'll do is we'll go and extract our transition materials from the global south. We'll turn the Democratic Republic of Congo and Chile and other areas into sacrifice zones so we can fuel our north transition here. That's not system change, that's not a just transition, that's just continuing as normal. And it's our years or 500 years, we've said, of exploitation, of extraction and disregard for the natural world, which has put us in this mess now. We're not going to solve that by replacing it with another system of exploitation and extraction of resources and of wealth and turning more countries into sacrifice zones as well. Not sure where I'm going down, actually. I think I've just gone down a little lane. Not sure that was a question. But yeah, so I guess just going back to how we look to implement this as well, it's like building that power within the movement of movements, understanding that all of our different intersectional issues and global crises is underpinned by capitalism and the current systems in which we are a slave to currently, and those obviously are suffering much worse in other areas. And then there's opportunities to implement things like this. But yes, a fundamental shift in the way that we approach everything, whether it's our activism, whether it's our campaigning, it's understanding that internationalist viewpoint and working together with partners across the world and looking to amplify stories, looking to build genuine solidarity and looking to stand shoulder to shoulder with people who are fighting against the same systems that we're fighting against here. And then I think it could be implemented, but it's not around just looking to pass a policy within Parliament. It's about a fundamental shift in people, and it's about building that movement, not just here, but building that movement globally. And then, I'm very confident, and I need to be, so I can sleep at night, confident that we can have these changes. Thanks.
Yeah, we're gonna take one thing, and then I'm gonna take one more question. You're the last question, and I'm gonna ask just to get a last word from each of the panelists, and to say also the last thing they want people to go away from here with.
Sorry, just want to go back to the question about media, because I think that's a really important thing to think about, especially with climate campaigning here in the UK, and XR in particular, which is, don't assume that the right-wing media is doing anything different or doing anything that it's not meant to be doing, right? Its job entirely is, as stated in its objectives, in its funding patterns, is to manufacture consent for the system. That's the title of a book by Noam Chomsky, in fact, right? So we have to forget that, in my view, that we're somehow going to produce the same or counter the propaganda of the right-wing media, right? Because the right-wing media includes state media, right? And who is the state media? It includes the BBC, right? The BBC never put out any live stream of South Africa's judgments for Palestine at all, but instead put out Israel's defense. And that was the BBC. Right? BBC is state-sponsored propaganda, right? So I don't think we should be in the business of trying to suggest that the BBC should even be doing anything different, right? We should accept that this is state propaganda. The right wing exists as the spokesperson for capitalism, and just get on with our organizing and get on with our mobilizing. We would never ever try and match essentially the limitless funding available for the creation of new TV stations, newspapers, online platforms, blogs, think tanks, academics, university departments that are all engineered and designed to produce propaganda for capitalism and imperialism. So it's a non-starter to think that we can ever match those levels of propaganda. But what we do know as curious and knowledgeable citizens is to organize and mobilize with people like ourselves internationally.
We're just taking the one question, I'm sorry, just because we're out of time. You over there at the back, no, one behind you, sorry.
Probably my biggest frustration with politics here in this country in the last few years has been the approach to the right-wing media from what should be the leading progressive party in this country, which unfortunately has become not the case since Corbyn lost power. The approach from Starmer has been basically, famously, the Ming Vase strategy. Corbyn's was to campaign like Trotsky around the country on a train and speak to people wonderfully, in meetings like this, but not really engage with the media because he knew that he felt that there probably wasn't much point. And then, but going back to Blair's time, their strategy was to actually make sure to get something, to use a vision that they had, whether we liked it or not. They used a politics of vision to make sure that they got themselves in the news at least 3 times a week. That was an actual strategy, very conscious strategy on their part. You were making a really interesting, or alluding to a really interesting strategy, which I've been thinking about as well recently quite a bit, which is to actually propose quite controversial policies in order to get yourself out there. Because all the things that you've said they make an enormous amount of sense. People, when they hear that, a lot of people, I think, could be persuaded to vote for something like that. And that's where I think, something we could make a difference, like actually through the political system that we have, which is screwed as far as I'm concerned through first past the post. We have to move away from first past the post.
Thank you so much, and I saw a lot of nods in the room as well. It was a really, really good comment, and it does kind of sum up a lot of what we've been saying about this being a sort of manifesto and lots behind it. So I just want to hand over to the panellists to give us one sentence each of what the last thought they'd like us to go away with, starting with you, Daisy.
I'm just going to do a small list of other things that I think that we need in order to tackle the outsized finance sector and big corporate power. So we also need antitrust, anti-competition laws to kind of reduce these monopolies and break them up. Transparency is a big thing we've talked about. Strong unions, ending tax havens, so a land value tax would do that, and fighting the lobbying power and corruption in our kind of revolving door politics.
Daisy sets the benchmark. Everyone's got to be even shorter than that. She was brilliant.
Oh, good. Okay, last sentence then. So, thing to take away, I guess, is that justice won't be handed down to us by world leaders, and it won't be delivered by corporations. It's up to us to build the future that works for all of us, and we need system change that comes from the ground up. And to solve these problems, we have to solve them all together. And climate justice, and the climate justice and real justice element of that, recognises that all of our struggles lead back to that same unjust system.
Thank you so much, and Keval.
And before I wrap up, can I just say thank you to everyone for coming, the questions, thanks to the panelists, thanks to Rob, thanks to Ben, thanks to Caroline, for everyone in the kitchen, for the beverages, the film crew, thank you very much, sound, all of you, thank you very, very much. Can you give everyone a round of applause, please? I just want to say a lot of the work that I'm doing is within a campaign website called the Revolutionary Reparations. If you want to get involved, please reach out on that platform. It's the beginning of a new global campaign for sustainability, for peace, for justice. Thank you.
And yeah, one more time, just keep that applause going. Thank you to Exile Wandsworth, Money Rebellion, everyone who's taken part with the sound, filming, production. And thank you for being here. Thanks once again to Daisy, Tyrone, and Keval.